District of Conservation is sponsored by CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thank you so much for listening. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Before I dive into today's interview with Ashley Hlebinsky, I want to briefly talk about my upcoming testimony before the Kansas State Legislature tomorrow. I'm going to be talking about property rights in the context of foreign land holdings and also even domestic holdings and how sometimes they infringe on property rights. And I will be speaking before, in particular, the Kansas Special Committee on Foreign Adversary Investments and Land Purchases with a chief emphasis on property rights. The hearing will be broadcast on YouTube at 10:30 Eastern, 9:30 Central. I will include links for you to check it out. But it's a very big opportunity. I've come very close to testifying before a state legislature before here in Virginia. The bill was tabled indefinitely, and I hope I get an opportunity there because it's on protecting independent contractors, a little separate from this podcast, but this is related to conservation in a sense, and I can't wait to do this. It's a little nerve-wracking, first experience. I've done national TV. This shouldn't be too difficult to do because this is not really speaking before millions of people, but preparing a speech, having footnotes, it's a tall order to do this all yourself, and I'm doing this on behalf of CFACT, who is sponsoring. Typically, I would do this type of stuff with IWF, but CFACT was like, you should do this, and I am. And so you can catch that again tomorrow, 9:30 Central, 10:30 Eastern. Link to the YouTube broadcast link will be included in the show notes. Now to today's guest. I first heard about Ashley several years ago when she was working for the Buffalo Bills Center of the West Firearms Museum, and we have a lot of mutual friends. And I figured it was time to have her on the podcast. I've been really thoroughly impressed by her work. She is extremely knowledgeable about history, being a firearms historian, and she has done a lot in her 15 plus years of work. And she's a firearms historian specializing in material culture studies, as well as firearms and ammunition-related museum consulting work. She's also an expert witness, freelance writer, guest lecturer, TV personality, and producer. And as I mentioned, she was most recently the Robert W. Woodruff curator of the Cody Firearms Museum, overseeing the museum's full-scale multi-million-dollar renovation. She co-founded the University of Wyoming College of Law's Firearm Research Center and was just appointed their executive director. Get to know Ashley Hlebinsky, founder of the Gun Code LLC, in today's episode. Let me know what you think. Ashley, thank you so much for coming on my podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Why don't you talk about your background and how you got interested in historian work? Did you always have a goal to set out to be a historian, especially a firearms historian? So lay that out there for my listeners if you can.
So I did not grow up around guns, which is kind of weird because I'm from Western Pennsylvania, which has a really thriving hunting culture. But totally, not a part of my life growing up. My dad managed a rec center, and his pastime was golf, and my mom's a physics teacher and she's a professional figure skater too. So in no way did that ever meet with firearms. It wasn't we didn't like them. It just wasn't a part of our culture. And I spent most of my childhood, teenage years, and first semester of college wanting to be an orthopedic surgeon, which is a little different than what I ended up doing. I spent a lot of time in and out of the operating room when I was younger. I was in a wheelchair for a little bit in middle school. And so that was just kind of what I knew and what I thought I wanted to do. But I was always interested in the history of medicine. I guess I just didn't really ever realize that, people work at historic sites and museums until I got to college. But during my first year of college at the University of Delaware, I went on a Civil War medicine tour at Gettysburg, which is about 3 hours from where I grew up. And they were talking basically about how the advancements of weapons technology, specifically in the Civil War ammunition technology, how that impacted injuries on the battlefield, which also then impacted how doctors and medical professionals had to treat those injuries pretty quickly on the battlefield. And I went to Colonial Williamsburg, got a similar spiel, different technology. And I was like, you know what, this is pretty interesting. So I changed my major to history. And my mom, she hates that I always say this, but like literally she was like, you just better have a job when you graduate, because historians don't, or history majors don't necessarily always have that when they come out of school. And so from that point forward, I started studying firearms, ammunition, kind of from a very generic ballistic standpoint, especially historical battlefield weaponry. And then I just got hooked. I did my first internship at a military museum in Western Pennsylvania. And there I had to catalog hundreds of guns. First time I'd ever held a gun before in my life. I think I just turned 19, maybe. It was 18 or 19. And so I was hooked. And so I did that internship. I learned how to shoot modern and historic guns and basically did every volunteer and internship program I could do throughout the rest of my college.
And I think I saw you had a stint at the Smithsonian Museum. Is that correct?
That's correct. So it's super random. So I knew, I wanted to work in firearms, but, you take your opportunities where you get them. And so there was a internship in the National Museum of Natural History's botany department. So I know nothing about plants. I still know nothing about plants. And it was to study early U.S. expeditions. And so I was like, well, that's interesting. And, U.S. expeditions are kind of tangential to the timeframes that I was interested in studying. So I applied for that internship and I never heard back. And they just didn't have funding at that point. And so ultimately the funding came through like 6 months later. And the summer in between my senior year and my first year of graduate school, I started in the botany department. And one of the cool things there is you get a Smithsonian email account. So I was able to quickly figure out the email account of the firearms curator over in the National Museum of American History. And I emailed him and was like, I'm interested in studying firearms. Can I come over and see the collection? And he was like, sure. There's a lot of funny stories with that initial meeting, but I ended up that summer spending a little bit of time in the firearms collection. I would basically go in and do my internship at like 5 a.m. The curator in the botany department also got up and into the office that early. So I would go and do that. And then I would spend some time in the afternoons in the firearms collection. And then I ended up just staying there for 3 years. I stayed there mainly spring, fall, and I did a lot of different things. I was a research fellow in connection with the University of Delaware. And during that time is how I got affiliated with the Cody Firearms Museum in Wyoming. And so I started working there summer, winters, so that I could kind of get a little bit of both worlds while I was in graduate school.
Talk more about your time as the Robert W. Woodford curator of the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, and your involvement with their Cody Firearms Museum, because that's how I think I first heard about you, because the gun industry is a very small industry, as everyone knows. But I remember you took ownership of that project and really helped it come alive. Could you talk about your tenure there? What did you accomplish, and how has the public received the Firearms Musician, and if there's been any opposition to it too? Because I know some people may oppose museums on these grounds, especially, but maybe your experience is different. So feel free to answer that as best as you can. That I loved
I would say my experience is definitely different. When I started at Cody, like I said, I was still in school, and I held a lot of positions there, but I became curator in 2015. I had to think about that for a second. I was ultimately with Cody for 10 years. But I took over as curator in 2015, and it was the craziest thing I think the Buffalo Bill Center of the West has ever done, because I was 25, I think. I was 24 or 25 years old, and who Whoever thought to take a chance on somebody that just started their career to run one of the largest gun museums in the country, the only accredited firearms related museum in the country. And in the middle of a renovation. So they also gave me the keys to the kingdom in terms of running a complete gutting of the museum, reimagining and reinstallation of the museum. And so it was kind of weird. And I learned on the spot. Really quickly, because when you study museums, I mean, my firearms knowledge was decent and I was always learning and I was always open to learn because our collection spanned not even 700 years, like 900 years of history. We had about 7,000 firearms, starting with hand cannons, which is the earliest firearm. And those date to at least the 1200s, but I think there's an example from the 1100s. And so I kind of had to figure it all out. I also had to learn how to budget and write grants, all the things that you don't necessarily learn in graduate school when you're studying museums, unless you take business classes, which they don't require. I had been to the museum for a couple of years at that point, and it was kind of interesting because when I first went to the Cody Firearms Museum, I was like, this museum is the coolest museum ever, and everybody knows it exists because it's so important. And then I was kind of shocked at how nobody in the industry, unless they'd been in the industry for 30 years, had any idea that we even existed. I always say that I'm not a part of the gun industry. I'm kind of tangential, but obviously having a firearms museum, we work a lot with gun companies. But I was shocked. We hosted this big event that used to go on with the National Shooting Sports Foundation, and I think it was FMG Publications at the time, called Shooting Industry Masters, which Cody hosted in 2013. And I was surprised because we had, 500 people from the gun industry and we were giving tours and everyone's like, what is this gun mecca that we never knew about? And that was kind of concerning and shocking to me as just an assistant curator, because I knew that a renovation was coming up and I knew that fundraising was coming up. And so I kind of started a concerted effort to get myself out there in gun media, get myself out there in all media, and, go to SHOT Show, go to all the trade shows, because we had to raise awareness, because if nobody knew we were there, then what was the point of, rebuilding the museum? So it was kind of surprising. It was like we were a big deal in the 70s and the 80s. And when we built the Cody Firearms Museum in 1991, but we lived on a legacy and we just didn't actively market ourselves. So I worked really hard before I became curator to have some level of presence. And then, it never kind of stopped, and it's not stopping today. So when I took over as curator, at least some people knew we existed, and I became the project director on our renovation. That was a $12 million renovation, and that reopened in 2019. But you asked about kind of the way that the museum was received, and it was kind of surprising. So the Firearms Museum is a part of the Buffalo Bills Center of the West, which is a 40-acre property, 5 museums, a research library. So all of the museums are under a 7-acre roof, and the Firearms Museum is about 40,000 square feet. So because of that, we actually got like 200,000 people through the door every year. People that were on their way to Yellowstone, were interested in the art museum or other museums. And so we had this cool opportunity to reach people from around the world that I think a lot of firearms museums don't get. If you're a standalone firearms museum, the people who are coming to that museum are interested in guns. But we learned through survey work that about half the people, so 100,000 people that came through the museum every year, really had no knowledge about firearms, especially our international audience. So it was surprising. And so when we were working on the museum, we very much wanted to focus on that 100,000 people and how could we create a museum where they felt comfortable, because a lot of those people maybe have hesitance around firearms, don't understand firearms, or only know what they're told in the media about firearms. So how could we create a museum that provided them a context for how integral firearms history is to understanding international history, which comes with good and bad things, and things that are neither good nor bad. They just are. And so we started really working on that. But we always, knew that we didn't want to alienate the other 100,000 people who were just coming to see the guns. And so we kind of did a lot of work to figure out how to do that. I created a committee that basically had everyone from your super hardcore gun guy to your people that really hated guns to review the material to try to find some level of, middle ground. And what was also interesting about that was we learned through that survey work that only about 3% of people that were coming through the center would refuse to come into the Firearms Museum. And I thought that percentage was actually pretty low. And so we didn't focus on them. They didn't matter to us because we were never going to convince them to come in.
And now you're a curator emerita and a senior firearms scholar, correct? Still at the museum?
So I'm actually, I stepped back completely from the museum.
Okay.
I still do our podcast, History Unloaded, but I decided long before the museum reopened in 2019 that I wasn't going to stay much longer after that. I believe very strongly in not working beyond your own relevance. And I was hired to come out to Cody. I learned so much. And I rebuilt the museum, and it was time for somebody else to kind of take it further than that. And so we had decided that my assistant curator, Danny Michael, who is the curator now, would take over the museum. And so I spent a year, 2019 to 2020 as the curator, but, transitioning and making sure he had all the paperwork, making sure our budget was closed on the renovation. I didn't want people to be like, well, she built it and then it fell apart and she ran away, right?
Aww.
So I hung out, made sure he was good to go. And then I stayed on in that capacity for one more year, just to make sure Danny was good as curator and, had everything that he needed. And so then after that, though, I stepped back completely. I mean, Danny's, one of my best friends, so I'm still always involved. But I know that, I wanted Danny to stand up in his own right, and he's so awesome and he's doing that. And I just felt like it was time for me to kind of step into the shadows for that. I just didn't want to, I'm kind of loud and I kind of have a big personality. So it was time, it was time to work on some other things.
And that is where I think you've kind of focused more on your consultancy firm, the Gun Code LLC, right? You're focusing a lot on that. Could you talk about what your consultancy does? I know you run it with your husband, but give the full picture about what you both do.
Yeah. So what's really funny is that his name is just on it. Oh. So the Gun Code is just a single member LLC. It's just something that I created. So it's like far less exciting than everyone's making it out to be nowadays. But when I started at Cody, one of the parts of marketing the museum was they allowed me to consult for other museums so that we could train people to understand firearms, because you kind of had this divide where you had museum people, so people who were classically trained in museums that had no background in firearms. And then you had people that had a background in firearms that had no background in museums. So I kind of started merging the gap, and I called my business Gun Code, and just kind of did that in Wyoming. And then when I moved to Arizona, I actually dissolved it in Wyoming instead of transferring it. And then I started it again. And I put my husband's name there because I knew he was going to consult at some point. And it's so funny because now that he's involved, everyone's like, oh, you and your husband found a Gun Code. And I'm like, no, I just put him on there, like, for grins. I knew he was going to do some stuff down the road, but it is really funny, how much people now talk about Gun Code because of some of the court cases I'm working on. And I think I told in a deposition or something when they asked me about my website, talking about my husband and I was like, I did that as a Christmas present, so you could feel like involved, but it was just me like adding him to the website so I could be like, look, you're a part of this now. But he's got a full-time job, so he doesn't really consult. That's more just for down the road. But so the consulting business is pretty much me, and it's divided about, in 2022, it was 85% historical consulting. So it was about 50% museums. And then I think it was, now I'm going to show that I can't do math. I want to say it was like 25% consulting for an auction house. And then about under 10% was TV. I write and produce television. I appear on programs, writing in general and guest lectures. And then about 15% was expert witness testimony, which is kind of, it's a big percentage, which I don't normally have. I've been doing expert testimony for a while. But in 2022, there was a Supreme Court decision that basically said that history is the most important determinant for the constitutionality of gun laws. And as a result, pretty much every historian in the country has had their phone ringing on both sides, because, everybody needs an expert now on firearms history from the founding era, the second founding era, which is around the ratification of the 14th Amendment. So everything's a little skewed right now just because of the Supreme Court and then bumping everything back down and making history so important. So normally it's museums and collectors and writing and television. And now the University of Wyoming College of Law's Firearms Research Center. But there's a little bit of a bump in my workload on expert testimony.
And given your expertise, you've been heavily sought out by Congress. You've also been sought out by particular forums. First, I want to ask you about your May 2021 Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution hearing, which was entitled "Stop Gun Violence, Ghost Guns." And I don't like to use that term either. But you attracted a lot of attention for your testimony on so-called, quote, ghost guns. Could you summarize the experience and discuss how privately made guns, more appropriately, do-it-yourself guns, why do they need to be demystified, and how they were more common than perceived, by the wider public?
So that was a trip. I think I found out it was a Thursday or something, and I had a work lunch, so I had a whiskey, and I got a phone call that was, I can't remember who it was from, but they were basically like, "Hey, we have a subcommittee meeting on, quote unquote ghost guns next Monday." I think it was Monday. No, it was Tuesday. Sorry. Would you be interested in talking to, it was with Senator Cruz's office. Would you be interested in talking to people from that office and see if it's the right fit? And so I talked to them, and they were like, "Okay, you've got to submit a report." The report could be short or long, but I'm an overachiever. So I think it was 20 pages footnoted, by Monday. And I had to fly. I think I flew on Sunday. So I spent Saturday gathering my notes, and then Sunday writing footnotes on the plane. And then they had given me actually bad information. They told me I had till Monday at 5 p.m. I had Monday till 10 a.m. to submit this report. So, it was the biggest whirlwind. I had never done anything like that. And you're not paid to do that, like you are with other expert testimony. And so I had this report that gets submitted the day before so that the subcommittee can review it. And then you give a 5-minute talk. And as you can probably already tell from this podcast, I'm a little long-winded. So I wrote it all down, which I've never really done before. I usually just speak off the cuff. And you sit there, and there's a timer, which is very helpful because that way, if you're rambling, you can kind of pull it back together. So you sit there, you've got your 5 minutes. And it was really pretty funny because the Republican senators that were there actually plagiarized my report, which I guess is a compliment, but made me panic because they were giving examples from my report, and I'm sitting there crossing things off of my speech and being well, I can't talk about that because here I am looking like Elle Woods in a pink suit, and if I repeat what they say, they're going to think that I don't know what I'm talking about and I'm copying them, when in fact it was the other way around. So I'm scratching things off my list, and I give my talk, and part of it's off the cuff and part of it's what was in the script. But what was interesting about that is that you don't get to speak unless you're spoken to in the kind of the dialogue portion or the question and answer portion. And so typically, Republicans ask questions of their witnesses, and then, or I don't know if I'm called a witness in that world, but then yes, Democrats ask it of theirs because they don't want to give a platform to, the other side's witness to say something important. But that didn't happen. So there was only one, I think, Republican senator that was there because Senator Cruz had to leave. So I was only getting questions from one person. So I was like, sweet, I don't have to do anything. This is going to be so easy. And then we go through one round, and because there were so few people there, Senator Blumenthal, who was the chair of that subcommittee, was like, well, let's go back around. And for some reason, he decided to ask me a lot of questions. And we had a rather interesting back and forth. That was actually really fun. I was surprised he would give me that kind of time. And it was a good back and forth. forth. I think I held my own. One of the things that continues to happen to me in everything court or committee related is that everyone wants to know my personal opinion. And I don't give my personal opinion because that's not anybody's business, because I'm not brought as, a witness who has an emotional connection to something. I'm here to give you history. You figure out what you want to do with it, kind of thing. So he and I went back and forth on that a couple of times, but I didn't give him anything, which was nice. So it was really interesting, and I was super nervous because I had this moment. I give credit where credit's due. Senator Blumenthal is the only person that came up to speak to me before my testimony. I did not see any other senators even bother to come talk to me. And he came up, and I didn't really know who he was because I hate politics, and I'm not really, everyone kind of warned me, but I was like, whatever, I don't care. And so he came up, and he was very familiar with my report, and he was very complimentary and thanked me for putting together something so comprehensive on such a short notice. And then he walked away, and like as we were sitting down, I was like, was he messing with me? I was like, wait, is this bad? And then, but to be fair, I think I made some really good observations. Some people say I made him look bad. And he came up and spoke to me afterwards too. I got the COVID fist bump or elbow bump.
Oh, right. At that time,
right
yes.
This was in the middle of COVID. But yeah, or I guess towards the end. But so it was, I really thought it was interesting. But I'd never done it before. I haven't done it since. So maybe I didn't do that good of a job.
No. They're just
totally
focused on so many things. Like you can't get anything firearms related. And because, it's a divided Congress. So the pro-gun majority in one chamber may want to do something, and then the Senate may say no. So it's, and they're fighting over keeping the government afloat or shut down to be determined.
Yeah.
So it's impossible to get this out there. But I think you did fine. I caught it. And I think people liked and appreciated your test. So I don't think it's you. I think it's Congress.
Yeah, no, I understand that. But what I was there for, and I love the ability to have this platform. So you mentioned the term ghost gun, and one of the things that I did talk about is that I tend to not use those terms unless we're speaking about like what they call it in a piece of legislation or whatever. So like if it's an assault weapon ban and that's what it's called, just for, brevity, I'll say that. But I don't use those terms specifically because I think sometimes they're misleading. And I understand having to, say something that people can feel like they get behind, but it's marketing. And what I've learned with my expert testimony is that a lot of times we call something one thing because it helps people get behind that, like the average person can wrap their brain around that. And they're like, oh, let's do that. And then they, you get to actually look at the law and they're not doing anything like that. And so the point of my testimony was, how can you measure efficacy if you're not doing what you're saying you're doing? And by not doing what you say you're doing, both sides should be, both constituencies should be pretty irritated, because you're not getting good information. And if you're not getting good information, then, it really polarizes the debate. And so I spoke about that, but then I also spoke about the kind of long history of privately made firearms, because let's be real, prior to mass manufacture, prior to major manufacturers, everything was privately made.
Indeed. Yep. No, and that's really interesting because I've done a lot of reporting work on so-called ghost guns, and I try to look for the facts. And I cited your testimony actually in one of my pieces, I think, regarding the Nevada law that they voted to make it illegal to have so-called ghost gun kits or privately made firearms kits. But I think the Supreme Court actually invalidated that law. So I was able to cite your testimony about how it's actually not some new phenomenon. They've been pretty readily acceptable. And the crime statistics show that they're not even used, not even infrequently. It's almost like rare if they're used in any, instance of crime too. So the occurrence and their usage may be over exaggerated, even though I think at the time the FBI was saying it more and more. So-called, ghost guns are being used in crime. So I think anyone can see, even those of us who aren't historians like you, that they are really kind of misconstruing it. So I think experts like you can help kind of deconstruct what they're talking about and debunk any of the assertions they make about it. So I think that also comes to where your work is sought after. people in different institutions and organizations have leaned heavily on your expertise and guidance. So that is what's led you. You alluded to the University of Wyoming College of Law and how you helped co-launch the Firearms Research Center. You were just appointed executive director. So talk about the center and what some of your goals are and what you hope to accomplish in this role that you have with them now.
This has been a project that I've been working with a scholar named George Moxery for a couple of years now, maybe 3 years. I don't even know anymore. But I was brought in because this was kind of George's baby. If you're not familiar with George, he basically with David Koppel and a lot of other people created the first case law book on the Second Amendment. So he's a professor, he's a lawyer. And so he is now also teaching a course on the Second Amendment at the University of Wyoming. So he came from the perspective of, I want to create a research center within the law school that can provide background on the Second Amendment, but then also create a pipeline to create firearms lawyers. And that can sound kind of misleading. We're not meaning Second Amendment attorneys necessarily, but people that work for Ruger or, Daniel Defense, people that are doing product liability. So that can be a lot of things. But I was put in touch with George because one of my biggest soapboxes is the fact that it's really hard to study firearms history, firearms material culture in the university system today. It's not difficult in Europe, but it is in the US, which is kind of ironic. And so I got put in touch with George and I was like, okay, cool. I'm not a lawyer, but if I, am a part of this, then I want to really make this a cross-disciplinary study. So the research center is not just law, but it's history. It can be public health. We're actually partnering with the Wyoming Department of Health and the VA right now on a suicide prevention initiative. But basically, the main long-term goal would be if you want to study firearms from really any discipline, you can come to University of Wyoming. And now that's the pie in the sky goal. But right now we're kind of working on multiple avenues. We've got our academic kind of track, and that is we've got research assistants. We're trying to currently gather scholars from around the country that are already studying this because a lot of times those professors are siloed and they don't know each other exists. So we're trying to aggregate the scholarship that's already available. And then hopefully, obviously we'll hope to get more scholarship from more scholars, academics moving forward. But that also means that we're trying to kind of buck the system in the sense of a lot of people that are the most respected in the gun history world are not your academic university professor. They're collectors, they're researchers, and I don't have any problem saying they're also YouTubers, And so I really want to see kind of a merging of a vetting system that, allows people without PhDs to be able to be respected in the same vein that a PhD would. So that's kind of one track. The other track is a practical application. We have a website that we're currently working on. Each piece kind of keeps getting launched. We'll have a brief bank where you can actually search different briefs for different cases. And that's if you're the media, if you're the public, if you're a lawyer and you want to come and get information, we're kind of the one-stop shop for that. So we want to see our research not just be, in the ivory tower, but then also how can we impact the modern debate. And then the last component of that is we want to do community outreach. So hunter therapy, safety courses, but the kind of main focus now is suicide prevention.
I don't know if any other university, especially law school, has that. So you've piqued my interest. My ears are perked. I don't have a law degree, but I'll tell my lawyer friends who are interested to look you guys up. But I would love to use you guys as a resource for any of my reporting work. Ashley, we've gone through a lot of topics. You are very impressive, and I hope everyone listening takes away a lot of knowledge that you've shared here, dispensed here, connects with you. What is the best way for my listeners to learn more about you, get involved with the various efforts you're involved in, support the different institutions you mentioned? List all those resources if you can.
For sure. So if you're interested in kind of following my eclectic nonsense, I'm at History and Heels on Instagram, and I'm at official Ashley Hlebinsky. Have fun spelling that on Facebook. I have a Twitter, but I don't use it, so no need to follow me there. If you're interested in what we're doing at the Firearms Research Center, you can email our email, which is frc@uwyo.edu. I'm currently answering most of those emails, so if you need something from me, you can also reach out that way. way. And then if you're interested in following us, we're firearmsresearchcenter.org. And then we're also at Firearms Research on Instagram, and we're Firearms Research Center, I think, on Twitter and Facebook.
All those links will be listed in the show notes for this episode. So I will make sure everyone gets that. Ashley, it has been so wonderful to talk to you. I'm glad we finally connected. I hope I get a chance to meet you in person sometime in the near future. But if any time I could be a resource or you'd like to comment on anything and be included in some of my reporting, let me know. I would love to help you out in any way.
That'd be awesome. Maybe we'll see each other at SHOT Show 2024.
Thanks for listening to District of Conservation. If you enjoyed what you heard today, go leave us some reviews on Apple and Spotify or wherever podcasts are played. Your feedback will help us reach more people, and I love to know what is on your mind after each episode. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat or a guest announcement, because that is our way of updating all of you listeners, and we have just hit 1,000 followers on Instagram for the podcast account. Thank you very much. And if you have any guest suggestions or topics you want to hear on the show, I am all ears. I would love to hear your feedback there. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode.